I suppose we ought to get the show on the road and start moving along, or we'll never get done by 12 noon. Gene Moore. I'm a psychiatrist practicing in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, who's got more wires than he knows what to do with here. And today we're going to talk about trying to separate out adoption from clinical issues. Yeah? I was hoping to get away from the mics. Yeah, I'll talk to the mic. I'm a psychiatrist who specializes in adult and child issues in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. And I'm an adoptee, and I've done a search, and I've been kind of involved in the adoption movement one way or another for a few years now. And they asked me to talk on trying to separate out some of the clinical issues from adoption. And I guess basically the bottom line of that one is there such a thing as an adopted child syndrome? And maybe we'll come to some answer with that this morning. I don't know. I've got a couple of talks that I've given over the years, in fact several, and I can get up here and give one, and it'll fascinate me no end because I know what's there. And I'm not so sure it'll fascinate you all. And I'd much rather get into a dialogue and discuss what clinical psychological issues are of interest to you all and are important. And from that, maybe we can come to some conclusions as time goes by. Let me find out a little bit about the audience here. Have we got any physicians here? Any docs? Psychologists? We've got a pretty good group. Social workers? Oh my goodness. Counselors of other stripe? A few. Have we got anybody who's not a professional? Some. Hooray. Have we got members of the triad, adoptees, birth parents, and adoptive parents? Oh my goodness, we have a good mixed group today. Well, what would you like to talk about regarding clinical issues? What do you want to cover? Separating out clinical issues from adoption. I brought along a comprehensive textbook of psychiatry just in case I get stuck. We can get that out too if we need to research something. It's about 2,000 pages, of which 2 are on adoption, give or take. It's sort of the Bible that psychiatrists use. Yeah?
I know that when I read number 7's workshop, I was hoping to hear about what adoption syndrome is, what are some of the characteristics, what adoptees share in common as their problems, what are some of the solutions. And for me, I found that I feel a lot of the adoption problems I've grown up with, such as fear of authority figures or whatever, are closely parallel to problems that people have post-stress shock disorders, people, ACOA people, adult children alcoholics, and it's confusing for me. It's like a stew of where I have adoption syndrome problems that are unique to adoptees in my life, and then where are my problems? I grew up in an alcoholic home too, for instance. And they're similar, and it's kind of hard to find out what my priorities are and then to treat them appropriately.
Yeah, this girl's checking on my wires, making sure I'm hooked up right. Yeah. What other people think? Yeah.
Already, I have a big problem. I don't hear the question at the beginning, and I get lost and lose a lot because I haven't heard the beginning. And I suspect it may be true for some of the rest of you. If I'm the only one, I'll shut up.
No, we've got a bad room for acoustics. When a person asks a question, could they stand up and do their best to yell? I have the advantage of electronics up here. I was hoping we'd have something a little more intimate here than we got, but we got what we got. The gentleman was saying that he grew up in an alcoholic home and that there's many parallel issues between adult children of alcoholics and feelings that adoptees have, and also drew the parallel of the post-traumatic stress problems that have been so well documented in the press, and wondering if that might not also parallel adoption issues. Did I paraphrase it close? Okay. Yes.
I'm an adoptive parent, and we find as adoptive families, when they realize they need to go for therapy, that quite often they get in there and the adoption issues are discounted. And so that I was here to get a clear understanding of what is and what isn't.
Did everybody hear that? That sometimes in therapy adoption issues are discounted, and so it's a matter of what is and what isn't. Yes, way back.
Okay, then on the birth parent end, I'm wondering if there's a defined syndrome of birth parent that's the issue of like adopted, having been out long enough now where we can go through professional services to see how birth parents.
The question is there a syndrome for birth parents? Yes.
Maybe it's a personal issue, but I'm always curious about people who don't want to search and where you decide, is that a pathology or is it that they're not there yet or are they just not interested? So looking at that from a mental health perspective.
Yes.
Something on those of us that say, when we begin a search, that we're just looking for medical information and, information like that, when in actuality, that we really do want a relationship with our birth families, as well as our adopted families.
On the issue of search, there's a study out of Scotland where, in Scotland the records are open, and they tried to determine who searched and who didn't. And the thing that came out of that is that kids whose adoptive homes were relatively unhappy were more likely to search than kids whose adoptive homes were happier. Now, there's a recent study out that I just love that says 96% of all homes in America are dysfunctional. I like that one. Because one definition of normal is, if it's the majority, it's normal. So if we go the third step of that logical group, then dysfunction is normal, which just boggles my mind as a psychiatrist. I don't quite know what to do with that one. But I know in my work I run into darn few normal people. But I think why some people search and why some people don't, I don't know how on earth you're ever going to get a study in this country, in this culture, that's going to tease that one out. And I think this is the problem with trying to sort out all of the issues that we're going to try and discuss here today, is that in order to really tease things out, you have to do a study that samples all adoptees all across the country, all racial, ethnic backgrounds, and standardize it out for all the possible placements that occur. And you have to, of course, examine not only those who search, but those who don't. And those who don't are an amorphous mass that is terribly hard to identify. And so how on earth can you ever design a study to really evaluate? And I think this is the problem that I see with so much of the adoption literature that deals with clinical matters, is that people like myself write based on what we see go through our office or through our clinic or through our hospital. And though adoptees outnumber others in such settings, particularly in adolescence, that's a skewed sample. I mean, let's face it, the majority of the American public does not see psychiatrists. It's only a minority that see us, although we sometimes think it's the majority. Sometimes we wish the majority would, but particularly those people who we disagree with. But it's hard to get samples. It's hard to be accurate. And so I think most all of the adoption literature is skewed, and most all of it comes from the position of the author, which may or may not be really objective. And a lot of it that I read is basically anecdotal, where the person writes about their experience from their perspective and what they have done in their lives, professionally, privately, what have you. And I think if you get enough anecdotes pulled together, you can get some feeling of the whole. But it is just that. It's a little facet here and a little facet there. And I think that's one of the problems. How many people were here when AAC met in Boston some years ago? Yeah, okay. You remember that there was a talk given at that time on an adopted child syndrome. And the picture that was painted was, to say the least, bleak. The adopted child syndrome as portrayed consisted of such things as runaway and fire setting and a whole bunch of other antisocial kinds of behavior, and looked like, you know, not the kind of person you really want to have sitting at your table every night. And I guess I came away from that talk wondering how in the world I ever escaped. I never set a fire. I'm an adoptee. I thought, gee, I must be odd. I also have succeeded in life. And listening to the talk, I thought that was pretty strange, too. But the person that did it was talking from his clinical perspective of adoptees that he had seen go through his child-adolescent treatment unit. And he had seen a lot of acting out kids. And, of course, adoptees are overrepresented in those areas. Yes, sir?
Isn't that the real issue? I mean, where is it? I mean, everything is on a continuum. And to say that there's a syndrome is one way of just saying that in some way there is a separate issue or phenomenon there to be looked at. Do you see it as an object relations issue? How do you approach this whole matter? Brodensky is doing some control studies. There are some control studies. How do you see that? Could you just quickly give maybe an overview about where you see the view?
I see it in confusion. I don't know the answers yet.
Where do you see research? Is there any research being done that's invalid?
Oh, I think it's all interesting, but I'm not sure any of it is going to be the final answer. And I think this is the point, is that it's just one more facet. It's not a final answer.
The issue, an identity issue then?
Well, that's the direction I would tend to lean. What do you folks think?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I've been putting together composites of information on all of this on computer for I didn't know it was in a computer, but it's now on computer for about 12 years, and I pulled together from speech transcripts, from book excerpts, from television transcripts, from all sources available, and I've categorized these, and I'm selling them in the book room in the packet. This is the commercial. But I just want to tell you that you see certain patterns emerge. For example, I have a section there on eating disorders in the adopted child. I have one on suicide. I have one on substance abuse. And there are certain patterns that emerge, and the identity issue is a big one, but the rejection factor that eats away from the inside out is all part of it. And I just had a man that stopped in from, few of you know this already, from the hardware conference that's going on. He's a speaker over there, and he ended up in our book room, and it was like, are you in the wrong conference or what? And he's looking around picking up materials, and he came to my table, and he looked at where I had this whole array of material on the psychological problems with adoptees. And he says, my daughter's got all of these, and he bought a packet, and he took it home with him. So, you know, there are some recurring patterns, and we can't say that because it doesn't suit everybody, that it doesn't suit anybody. And these recurring patterns have to be addressed. And you know, like you say, you're okay. I've been married almost 30 years, and that's against the norm anymore, because 6 months to 5 years is about the norm. But I'm not going to say marriage is okay because I've been married 28 years, you know, so that's our trouble of generalization. But we have to address specific issues. We're now finding out that eating disorders, adoptees will tend to gravitate toward somewhere. Things like substance abuse. Nature abhors a vacuum. Where there's a hole in the center of your being, substances sometimes fill that hole. So, you know, we can't ignore them. They're there.
Yes, ma'am.
Our adoptive family was part of the statistics that fit into adolescent children having difficulty and having to be treated in the adolescent units in hospitals. And what frustrated us terribly was the state of denial that psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, and everybody there had with regard to whether adoption was a part of our son's concerns. And we had to float on our own to work through the situation. We had to educate them. And today I'm hearing parents coming to our meetings that this is still going on, that there's a lot of denial, that adoption plays a part in what our children suffer as they go through these adolescent years. Fortunately, the diagnosis that they gave to our son that he would continue to be institutionalized and possibly spend the rest of his life in jail terms did not happen in our family. It's because we were angry enough at the professionals to say, we know our son better than you do. And if he's in here for suicidal attempts and the tremendous pain that he's experienced over all these years for not having answers to his questions, for feeling totally rejected, for not understanding love in the form that we tried to explain adoption to him, that this was a loving act on his birth mother's part, for him to turn to us and say, that's a very confusing statement. If somebody loves you, they would find a way to keep you. Now, these are things that we had to work through as a family. Our son had a delayed adolescent time in his life because we had to see him through this. We as a family made the decision to search, to find his mother, in spite of all the people telling us that we shouldn't open up a can of worms. And our bottom line was, who has the right to decide what's a can of worms for somebody else? To Jeff, it was the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, to hear his mother's voice, to hear the same personality, the same intellectual capacity, the same sense of humor, to get answers directly from her, to have a woman who cared enough call the doctors up at the hospitals and the psychiatric unit and say, look, I'm here for you. And one of the happiest days of my life was when one of these doctors called and said, Jeff's mother was in touch with us, acknowledging the fact that he had two mothers. And so our son began a healing process. And today, at the age of 28, he's still attending college, but he's got direction in his life. He's self-sufficient, and we're very proud that we could dismiss some of the terrible things that we had that were ignored for us as a family that still continue today.
You're absolutely right. And I think, professionals as a group, we're not very good at dealing with the whole issue of adoption. And as I made reference a minute ago, comprehensive textbook has 2,000 pages, in which 2 is on adoption, and that's about it. As a professional, I don't know how you all deal with it, but when I am dealing with a family, and particularly a troubled youngster who's adopted, I'm in trouble. And the reason why I'm in trouble is all the standard tools and yardsticks don't fit. And the reason why they don't fit is one of the things that is very, very helpful to me in working with a youngster is knowing the family history. Because a great deal is genetic. There's an awful lot of us that is inherited. We're a little bag of chemicals going down the road. And what we're doing now in research is we're finding out that that little bag of chemicals influences our behavior a whole lot more than we used to think. Historically, that's kind of interesting, and I may get into that in a minute, but when you have an adoptive situation, the people who are sitting there looking at you and talking to you as mom and dad are genetically different from the youngster who is looking at you and talking with you. And so you're faced with how much was nature and how much was nurture. How much was the input into this youngster of what he was raised in, and how much was the genetic predisposition that was there ahead of time. And it used to be said, and I was born in the 30s, and when I was adopted, the standard thing was, you now have this piece of clay that you can mold into whatever kind of person you wish. Well, that's just a bunch of hogwash. My mother, like all mothers, found that she might be able to guide and shape a little bit, but damned if she could change much that was there. And this is the problem in dealing with adoptees. Now that I'm an adult, it's the same thing. What is the genetic predisposition of this youngster who's sitting there looking at me? I don't know the answer. And with the closed records that we have, I can't find out. And as a professional, many times with rather significant issues going on, when I try to find out, I run into the same stone walls that everybody else does when they try to find out for other reasons. And so then it gets complicated, then it gets exciting. And I don't find a whole lot of books that really help me with that, because we've got 3 things to deal with that youngster. How much of his behavior is his genetic background? How much of his behavior is because of the home he was raised in? And how much of his behavior is because of the fact that he was transplanted from one home to another, the adoption process? And which one of the three do we blame for what? And I don't have real good answers. Yes, sir, you had a comment.
Twins reared apart, literature give you much direction?
Twins reared apart is wonderful. I love the stuff that's coming out of Minneapolis. University of Minnesota up there. I think it's in Minneapolis, isn't it? Because they're pointing out that even such things as gestures, voice patterns, interests, habits, all kinds of things that we never thought were genetics that they are genetically predetermined. And it's fascinating. Now, how far that's going to go, I don't know. But it's good stuff. The thing that from a historical perspective is kind of interesting is back around 1880, 1890, medicine believed that everything was inherited. They were measuring lumps on the head, they were measuring facial configurations and everything else to determine madness and other psychiatric conditions. Freud started writing right around the turn of the century. And with Freud, the pendulum started to swing. And he talked about neuroses as the result of experiences in the lifespan. So by the 1920s, we got into the age of the child and the child guidance clinic with the idea that if we treat early enough that we won't have mental illness when people get older. And the pendulum swung so far that when I went to medical school, we were talking about schizophrenogenic mothers. Mothers who could create schizophrenia in their children by the way they double-binded them. Very shortly thereafter came the electron microscope. And very shortly after that came the computer. And with high-speed calculations and the ability to look inside the cell, a whole lot better than had ever been seen before, the pendulum started to swing in the other direction. And now we're back to probably where it was almost 100 years ago, in that we're saying that genetics and the neurochemistry has a great deal to do with what we are and who we are and how we behave. And the experiences that we have in life, the nurture part, is of less importance, and we're all scratching our heads trying to figure out where this pendulum is finally going to settle. But it's kind of fascinating that over 100 years it's gone from one extreme to another, and now it's coming back with a rush. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a possibility that we as an adoption movement are missing the boat? And most of your search and support groups, basically support groups, are for adults. You can join, but we won't touch anything until you're 18 or 21. And I've had experience recently in our county alone of trying to accumulate data information by pulling out amended names out of our court and talking with our local juvenile officer. And I'd say at least half of them were in some way, shape, or form had problems, whether it was an in-family adoption, whether parents divorced and remarried and the new father adopted, or just regular adoptions. Are we missing the boat by not having support groups for teenagers in the rough years when you're questioning everything?
Sure.
Like this lady said, how old was your son at the time?
Well, our son had serious problems from 6th grade on. And, you know, this is it, he was dismissed as, every time we went for help, it was dismissed as it's a stage that he's going to pass through. And we kept waiting for it to pass. And it intensified, but he was definitely grieving terribly. He needed understanding. And I think that's a very important thing to be thinking about for the children coming up in life.
I know that there is a support group out in San Diego now for teenagers. And we should really start with them to prevent some of the problems that we had as an adult adoptees.
Excuse me, can I just ask a question about the taping? Because I know this is being taped.
Yes.
Are the people's comments and questions going to be included on that tape? Because
I hope it's picking up. I told the young lady about what we were doing here, and
she
here we are.
Okay, I think we need to check that, because it's really, it's so important.
Yes.
The value of the tape. All right, thanks.
Yes, sir.
I like some things that Betty Jean Lifton says about the blindfold analogy, that people come into life, adoptees come into life blindfolded. And rather than, I think what professionals have done is for so many years we've left on the blindfold and we've given them seeing eye dogs and pills and all kinds of things. That finally somebody comes along and says, take off the blindfold. And I think a way to begin separating out some of these issues is start with adoption, not end there. And I'm a clinical social working in a mental health clinic. And while it's tough sometimes to get people, adoptive parents and so on, to appreciate the adoption issues too, that I think that's the place you have to start. I think you rule that out because it's such a significant event in a person's life, or for birth mothers, of course, too, if birth mothers are treatment. But I think to start with that is one way to ferret out, like how much of it's related to adoption. And I certainly agree, in terms of adolescence, I've done a number of searches for adolescents. I think there's no evidence to support the contrary view that adolescents have enough garbage to go through, you don't need to clutter it with a search and the introduction of another set of parents. I simply think there's no evidence other than horror stories to support that are unfounded. And I think once you deal with that doesn't mean once you take off the blindfold that you don't need the seeing eye dog or the pills or something like that. You may need some of those other supports. But I think you start with adoption. And I'm more and more getting like really a rigid position on that. Because, and part of that I guess is my frustration with other professionals who say, well, so what? You know, adoptive parents say, well, my son's a doctor, I care about it. Well, so what? You know, what's the issue? I think that's where we have to start.
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to make a comment about that because recently I'm a social worker in the agency and we just got a videotape, a professional adoption videotape that was presented by an adult adoptee and who is also an adoptive parent. And she said the exact opposite. She said you should start and rule out all the other issues, and then if it's not other issues, then look at the adoption issues. So I think your comment about the profession being somewhat muddled and confused, I'm getting muddled and confused.
Well, I think, you know, it's, okay, how do you rule it out? If a youngster is adopted, how do you know there isn't schizophrenia in the family and you're seeing the prodrome of an adult schizophrenic process starting in adolescence? You know, it's a brick wall. And if the youngster is adopted, there's just so much that you cannot do. I guess one of the great tasks of adolescence is identity. The question, who am I, where am I going, and what's the meaning of all this? From what I see, it seems like adolescence is the time that most adoptees get in trouble. And this is why they overpopulate our clinics and our offices. Now, the identity issues don't go away in adolescence. They usually get resolved and we kind of press on with life. But some people are finally figuring out that we're not stagnant from the time we're 18 until we're 68. And that we do change. Lord, do we change. And that somewhere around the middle of that whole time, there's another identity crisis that goes on. And that's somewhere between ages 30s into the early 50s. And we stop and re-examine again the question, who am I and where am I going? And what is the meaning of all this? And this is where men start buying Porsches and having affairs and doing all those kinds of crazy things, just like adolescents start doing crazy things. But it's also the time when adoptees start searching. It's time, as you know from a lot of your work, the majority of people that search don't search as adolescents. They search as middle-aged people who are going through another time of identity. And so I kind of lean heavily on the identity issue as a pretty big piece of the pie. Now, I don't think that's the whole answer by any means, but I think it's a piece. Yes, ma'am.
If I could have another minute. One of the things that the way I try to describe this is I'm not a professional, but I do a lot of counseling. As all volunteers have in this room, we've ended up counseling one another. And what I see from all this research that's pulled together is that the factor of adoption acts like a magnifying glass throughout childhood. Every issue that's important to non-adopted children
is adopted, you know, in a wide span by the adopted child. For example, self-esteem, which is a problem for any child. In the adopted child, it's magnified. Issues of identity, who am I, which every child is seeking, but the adopted child is magnified. Issues of rejection, you know, if the kid next door will play with me, the other child, the non-adopted child, will work through this and it's not that traumatic. But for the adopted child who has had a rejection, it becomes magnified. If it's a thing like separation, a divorce in the family, or a parental separation, or a death in the family, which is traumatic for any child, for the adopted child, it's another separation, another. So you can just take any issue that's important to a child and magnify it by maybe, you know, X number of times, and that's where you can see it. The same issues, but they're much, much greater.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I heard something interesting too, that, you know, through the adolescent years, we all draw away from our families and become our own persons. And I call it, you know, we're thrown in the sifter, the parents, and parts of us are kept and they move on with other influences in their lives. Okay, well, an adopted person can separate from the adopted family, but they have no opportunity to separate from the original family in that healthy process. What does that do to them?
Another piece of confusion. From my point of view, just another piece of confusion. Yes, sir.
One idea that I've read out of the twins reared apart, not the newer stuff, but even the older stuff, comes up with an idea that actually twins reared apart are in some ways more alike than the ones that were reared together. And I'm wondering what that's all about. It's an interesting thing. Is it that maybe there was no differentiation available, and therefore you really do have to differentiate against your genetic past, or you know, how can we get at this whole identity issue in terms of
The whole identity issue gets real interesting because it's Erik Erikson came up with probably the best stuff on identity that anybody has written, and I think that's why Betty Jean Lifton's stuff reflects his thinking so much. He sits in her kitchen periodically, and I think that's why so much of her writings are heavily influenced by identity issues and by Erikson's theories. When you read most of it, it gets vague real quick. It gets away from concrete real quick, because when you start talking about who am I, you get into difficult verbiage. The language doesn't do it well. Everybody has trouble struggling with that one, and everyone re-examines it periodically through their lifetime. And we get our sense of identity not only from ourselves, but from how other people behave toward us. This is why, for so many people, big changes in life, particularly the third identity crisis, is retirement. When one gives up pieces of one's identity and has another identity crisis. It gets complicated, and I don't have a quick, simple answer.
hope for those changes differentiates the person who does have identity versus one who is maybe more in moratorium in terms of his own personal identity and therefore cannot cope.
I think coping is a key issue. And I think this is why we don't see some adoptees either at these meetings, we don't see them in our clinics. They just go on with their lives. Something in them, they are able to cope with the issues. They're able to cope with the identity issues. They're able to cope with the issues of life and living. And then comes the question, why? Why are they able to do so well? And I think sometimes we focus on why some do so poorly. But why are some adoptees doing so well and are comfortable and have no need to look beyond what is immediately there? Is it their genetics? Do they come from, really good stock, so as to speak? Is it the way they were raised? Were they given a really firm foundation in who they are and what they're going to do in their lives? Or is it a combination of the two? Or is it just plain good luck? I don't know. Yes, ma'am?
Coping well or is denial?
You're right. That's another question. Coping well or denial? I don't have an answer. For some people, denial is a healthy coping mechanism. And I think the scenario that comes immediately to mind is working in hospice, terminally ill patients, who, for them, denial of the immediacy of death is an acceptable coping mechanism for the time being. It's certainly not good for the long term, but boy, it sure gets them through the day. I think sometimes we look at denial as being all bad. It's not all bad. Sometimes it can be very healthy. Yes, ma'am.
I guess my question would be that whatever is being denied has to get played out in some other way. And I'm thinking of my own son. I'm a birth mother. And, you know, my understanding has always been that somewhere in his psyche he's angry with this process, but he was indeed abandoned, although loved, you know, that paradox. But he denies that to me and apparently to himself. And, you know, he had a wonderful life. His adoptive parents were very good to him. It was fine. It was the best thing for him. In the meantime, he's had to file for bankruptcy. He is totally irresponsible spender. I mean, and will spend things like $500 for a little management kind of booklet and a couple of seminars to go with it. I mean, he's just forever. So even though he's having to file for bankruptcy, he continues to act in a way that looks to me really irresponsible and scary. And for me, the question keeps popping up. Is this, you know, this sense of who am I and what is my identity getting played out in that kind of behavior? And I know there's no easy answer, but I'd like a way to look at it, you know, a way to approach it that would be a help for me in somehow assisting him through that or helping him to look at that.
I haven't got a pat answer. I think one of the ways of dealing with denial is to simply bring up the subject and inquire. And by simply mentioning it, you break through the fact that it's there. Because denial can be so complete that it can be just not even in the consciousness.
And call it, you're saying, and call it denial. Say, you're telling me that you're happy, but my sense is that you're just, I mean, would you?
Well, it's always worthwhile to point out to anybody. My wife does it to me periodically, how I say one thing and do another. It brings into consciousness what I'm very good at getting rid of. You know, I can say we got to spend money, and then I'm out buying things for me. You know, wait a minute. It's always worthwhile pointing out dichotomies between what people say and what they do. People many times can then bring them into congruence so that things make more sense. And many times you can indeed get rid of denial. I have a friend who was in analysis, and it took, I forget how many weeks before he finally mentioned the fact, oh yes, I was adopted. And his therapist got very excited very quickly. No, it's not important at all. Well, it's bloody important. And it was important to him. In fact, you know, in retrospect, it was so important it couldn't be discussed early with a stranger. It could only be discussed later with greater trust. So, you know, it's worthwhile discussing.
In response to this birth mom, as a birth mom too, I think it's really important to realize that adoption issues may be related to this, but having home children too, you can realize some of the same circumstances come up and it might have nothing to do with adoption. So just keeping all the alternatives out front, so if it is there, it can come up.
I realize that, you know, a lot of my guilt can get played off in the interpretation of what
Yeah, you got to be careful about taking responsibilities where there aren't any.
I think there's another facet that nobody's really gotten into, and I don't know how anybody could research it, and that is the fact that when you're dealing with your own genetic children, your own biologic children, you know how they think. We've got two, and one of them thinks just like I do, and I know where she's going to be before she gets there. My wife can do the same thing with the other one. When you have an adopted child, you don't have that genetic advantage. You're always about a half a step behind, trying to figure out what the kid's going to do next or what they're thinking next. And that puts adoptive parents at a bit of a disadvantage. Now comes the question, does that cause a long-term chronic communication problem that causes a dissonance in the relationship that can augment some of the things that we see blossom in adolescence? Does that cause identity issues, rejection issues, because there isn't the harmony in thought and conversation, because there's a genetic difference? Is that a piece of the puzzle? I think maybe it is, but I don't know how on earth you're ever going to measure it. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to speak in favor of the gene mix. Any of us who've had several biological children, I have 4, and 3 went sliding through adolescence smoothly, and 1 fought every inch of the way. And if she'd been an adoptee to focus on, I mean, she would have had every problem that you can name. But she was born with that temperament, and I'm convinced a lot of it is just some adoptees aren't troubled at all, and others are very troubled, and I just think it's the temperament they were born with.
Does her temperament look like any shirt-tail relatives going back that you can see in the family? So she's following a family tradition that pops up periodically.
Well, maybe. But I mean, you know, I can see that she would have had a lot of trouble if she'd been an adoptee.
Yeah. And these are the things that make it all so difficult, because we like to, I think as people, we like to find very simple solutions and simple answers to very complex problems. It's the way we are. And mankind, if the facts don't fit, we'll make up a belief system so that we don't have to worry with the facts. We've done that since time immemorial. And there's all kinds of wonderful theories. And when we struggle with something as complex as this, to which the answers aren't there, we'll come up with theories that make it simple and make it easy. And we'll scapegoat some one facet, and usually inaccurately.
But it just seems to me that if you give people an opportunity to talk about things, in my case, and I would swing to the side of saying you deal with adoption issues first, if I'm really off target, people will let me know that. I think part of the problem is, not only in therapy, as a society, we've spent so much time and energy trying to convince ourselves and everybody else that having kids by adoption is no different, that it isn't even safe to talk about. So I think if you give people an opportunity to talk about it, if you give people an opportunity to deal with those things, like adoption reunion, absolutely the most powerful healing and resolution that I've seen in 25 years of social work practice. That once those things are kind of dealt with, I think people say, an adoptee would say, I did put too much in the adoption basket. Now that I know all these things, I'm still struggling with overspending or overeating or drinking or whatever. And there's some other things. But I think unless we provide an environment like, I mean here, this is a skewed one for sure, but an environment in society and therapy for people to talk comfortably about adoption issues, they're never able to do that. I mean, depending on how you phrase the question, you've never thought about looking for your birth mother, surely. Well, is that a safe, an adoptee, an adolescent? Are they going to say, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I think about it every day? If I miss on them, they'll tell me for sure. But if I don't provide that opportunity, it'll never come up. And that's a major concern that I have about professionals and society in general. We don't give people an opportunity. And in a hostile environment, I didn't think I ever saw women who were sexually abused. I didn't ask the right questions. You provide an opportunity. Now, just about every woman I see, I ask that. If I miss, if it's absolutely not an issue, they let me know that. But I think you have to, well, in order to ask questions, you have to know what questions to ask.
Yeah. I think almost everybody that is connected with adoption in any way will say that it is a singular event that is important to all parties involved. Now, how important and how it's manifest and how it affects each of the people is another matter entirely. But I don't think anybody would discount it as an unimportant event.
I'm with the Post Adoption Center in San Antonio and do various things, but one of the most interesting has been not therapy, but just provide a 2 or 3 hour period of time in which children, first with the latency age group at 7 to 12, period of time that they can come in and spend time with me, and we have activities that I instigate that brings out issues about us that are because of the people who created us, and we determine the terms, whether they know first names of their birth parents or however. But for example, doing a brown paper outline of a child, and then they get all the features and things filled in, and then on one side there are things about us because of the people who created us, long fingers perhaps, and then on the other side, mom and dad made musical lessons available, those kinds of tie-ins. Lately, we have been getting calls from families who are really in distress and have had their children to, probably no Texans in here, but San Antonio has this dearth of hospitals suddenly, and they seem to be, everybody's struggling to convince you that your child needs to be in there because they all need money. So most of these families have had their kiddos, no offense, but I mean, that's, if you're in San Antonio, it's fairly well acknowledged.
Way like
and
that.
a lot of the people there, a lot of the doctors and the staff there don't know what to do with a child who is adopted. And these families have told us that they've spent X dollars and X years, and you have a 9-year-old who just needs to talk about the fact that she originated elsewhere and that Jeanette made this decision because. It's amazing how much comes out when they just have a safety environment to talk about. They don't do it freely. I get, to adult eyes, I get pretty stupid to get things rolling. But at the end of the time together, and of course their parents are with another, those of you who know Joanne Slade, and at the end of the time together, they're welcome to tell their parents anything they want to about what we've done, or to ask me to tell them, but I tell the parents nothing. If there were something that I felt was really, truly, you need to see a psychologist, psychiatrist, I would certainly have that prerogative, but it's a safety.
Now, it's amazing what communication can do to help.
And that's all it is
Absolutely.
allowing them to know that their parents know they're adopted, and it really is okay to bring some of these things up, and letting their parents know that if your child doesn't bring it up, it doesn't mean they're not thinking about it, and giving them some guidelines on how to reasonably, without child sneezes and you I can't think of an example for that, but
Get a blood
give
culture.
the parents the comfort that it was so nice to tell that little story when they were young, but things are a little complicated now because their comprehension has changed, or their understanding of the same exact words will be very different now. So here's some things that you can do to make yourselves be more comfortable so your children know that it's okay.
Well, you know, a couple of cornerstones of raising children, from what little we agree on about it, is communicating with kids helps. And being honest with your kids is a good idea. And there's a lot of that with adoptees that just plain doesn't happen, particularly the being honest. And so, you know, to me, it's not too surprising that it would appear that adoptees have more trouble getting through adolescence, because there many times is not the same degree of honesty that there are with other kids. And I think what happens a lot of times that I see, at least in my work, is that when parents say, we don't know anything about where you came from and we really don't have anything, a lot of adoptees in the back of their head say, bull. They know and they're not telling me. And there's the assumption of a lie. And there's the assumption of a breakdown in communication. And then we're on the road.
I think one of the difficulties that we faced in living this adoption experience as a family is realizing that adoptive parents in the family situation were set up to not deal with this in a realistic way. Our children were given to us through an agency that said adoption really isn't that different. Now, we're older adoptive parents, so I hope things have changed along the years. But if you love this child in the proper way, if you give this child the proper home, you're not going to be running into these difficulties. And so as the years go by and a very normal, healthy process comes along of questioning from our sons and daughters, we take it upon ourselves that we are not doing something right, that these questions are coming to us. So before there can be communication within the family, adoptive parents have to understand what it's all about, because their sons and daughters can sense the awkwardness, the uncomfortable, feelings that their parents have in not being able to deal with their own issues regarding adoption. Adoption is different.
You
We
bet.
love our children in the same way that other parents do, but growing up adopted is a different set of circumstances for a mother and a father and the whole family.
Do you have any suggestions on how to reach your peer group in terms of adoption and the issues?
How to reach psychiatrists about adoption? Oh, I got a bunch of great ideas. Most of them aren't worth a hoot. Years ago, American Psychiatric Association meets once a year. And years ago, they always had a section on adoption issues. And it was usually held in a room about this size. The last one that I went to was, it's got to be 7 years ago now. There were 6 people in the room. There was 4 papers being presented, 4 of them with speakers. I was there listening, and there was one other person there listening, and that was it. So let's put it this way, the interest was low. That's the last year they did it. Prior to that, there was a bit more interest. But I think it's like so many issues in the field of psychiatry. It's of interest primarily to the people who are dealing with it. It does not have broad appeal. And there's a lot of interesting data, but there's not a lot that's really firm. And I don't know why other psychiatrists aren't more interested in it. I guess in our area, I've become the local expert, and I get the phone calls. What do I do with? Kind of questions. And that's because I express an interest and I'm open about my interest. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to possibly address that a little bit with an example. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and a small agency outside of Cleveland, but in northeast Ohio, got a federal grant to do training for mental health professionals around adoption issues. It's a 2-year grant, and they're 1 year into it, and they've had a fabulous response to all the training sessions that they've set up. They've been most of the full capacity with a wide variety of professionals, including like school counselors and teachers, as well as the more traditional mental health professionals, psychiatrists and psychologists, as well as social workers. And I think there are monies available for agencies or for groups who want to start that training. And I think there is becoming more and more of an interest in it. And I think then that's a starting point for further discussion for all these professionals. And they're going to develop a list of people who attended, so you can circulate that amongst agencies so they'll know who to refer to, the people who have been to the training. And they're also now doing adoptive parent training as well.
Yes, ma'am.
Maybe this is putting you on the...
Why not? I volunteered.
I would like to take it one more step as far as educating physicians, and the group of physicians that you never hear talking about, or I never see talking about adoption issues, are the OBGYNs, who still, at least in our state, are doing private adoptions. And you hear stories about birth mothers going back to the physician, 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. Usually they're dead, which is probably the best resort. If they're alive, they say, oh, we don't have records, or, I don't remember. I'm real concerned. The adoptions are well represented, or the adoption agencies are well represented here. And I think social workers are really working hard at figuring out what we need to do now. And I'm worried that the physicians doing, I don't know what percentage of placements aren't coming along with us. You said, are there any doctors in the room? And there wasn't.
No, there wasn't. Yeah, I got personal feelings about it, and I don't, I've got a little bit of data to back it up, but not a whole lot. I don't like single people of any stripe doing adoptions, whether they're attorneys or whether they're judges or whether they're doctors. I like agencies doing adoption, agencies that have a bit of history, and agencies who cannot vanish when somebody dies, because doc's going to die. And if he's a solo practitioner, what is his widow going to do with the records? Well, she doesn't want them in her basement, obviously. And the liability of keeping them is horrendous, because I don't know whether you know medical malpractice or not, but you can go after a doctor's estate after he's dead and take it away from his kids. You know, we're to that point now. So there's a real good reason to get rid of records when Doc's dead. And attorneys, single attorneys, you know, they can fold up and be gone in an instant and run the shredder all day. So I like agencies who have a track record, who are going to be around, and whose records will stay. And if the agency goes out of business, the records pass on to some other agency who takes over. And I would strongly support legislation going in that direction. OB-GYN people, I'll talk to you later about personality of OB-GYN men. Though I can't do it standing up here with a mic.
At least in our community, more and more OBGYNs are women, and they're doing the same private adoptions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and they're young women physicians, and they're doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Are they getting a kickback? I don't.
They'll charge a fee for their time, I'm sure.
Yep, I'll pay for the malpractice insurance. They're going to get kickback.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm a clinical social worker in Portland, Oregon, and I'm really fascinated by all the things we're talking about, but I'm also frustrated because I came to this workshop because I have almost a whole caseload of post-traumatic stress people, and I do long-term work, and I have not found anyone in Portland, and I have checked everywhere, who's doing long-term work and dealing with issues of adoption. And so part of what I would do maybe is to connect with people here who are also doing that at other times, to get some more specific. Like we have a structure and framework for dealing with post-traumatic stress. We didn't have that 15 years ago. And that I'm trying to, I guess I look at adoption very similar to that in terms of trauma that happened often for people when they were very young. But I need to talk with people about this because I feel so isolated. And if anyone else is interested in that, please connect with me, or we can talk some more about the specifics or what issues are, how do we tease that out of the clinical picture, especially for long-term, people who are working on long-term healing.
I think and I'd be interested in hearing what other people have to say, but let me start it by saying the way I deal with people who are adopted and dealing with any issues is start with the symptoms that they've got, whatever that may be. Deal with those in traditional manner. When the issue of adoption comes up, I deal with it on two levels: identity issues and issues of rejection. If the person has not responded to traditional treatment, then I start raising the specter of genetic influences. And usually that gets raised in my head a whole lot earlier, because so many times genetics play such an important role.
Well, it's so confusing because on one hand, it's our ego strength that helps us deal with traumas and work through, and yet sometimes we're so traumatized we can't get enough ego strength. So I guess the way I'm picturing it for myself so far is that I do a little of other presenting problems, and then I bring in somebody, or I'm always holding that in my mind. How does that play into this? But rather than only focusing on adoption or only focusing on the other issues, so far for myself, I've been trying to back and forth with those things. And I don't know, but if the person doesn't have enough ego strength to face that deep emptiness inside, and yet knowing about themselves will help them, that's very confusing.
And comes the basic question of ego strength: is that an inherited trait? I think it is, a big piece of it. I think it can be raised or lowered by life experiences, but I think it's basic. I mean, just look at how many, you can think of families that produce losers, families that produce overachievers. You know, just the way it is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, that's always an interesting question. Is there such a thing as an overachiever, or has the person just maximized their capability? No. Yes, ma'am.
I need two questions. First of all, when the American Psychiatric Organization was having speakers, were they from within the realm of the psychiatrists who were attending? What were the presentations like? What kinds of issues that suddenly you only had two people attending the conference?
Yeah, the presentations that were given on adoption in the American Psychiatric Association were primarily by psychologists and psychiatrists working in the area of child psychiatry and dealing with, and what they presented was various and sundry aspects of psychopathology. The last one that was attended so sparsely, there was a woman from Oklahoma who was Native American and spoke on the legislation, the Indian Adoption Act. I forget the official title of it. And the history of that and the logic behind it. And she was a social worker, and I can't remember the tribe, from Oklahoma, but had been very instrumental in getting that piece of legislation supported by Hubert Humphrey just before he died and getting it passed. Quite honestly, I talked to the man who was in charge of that section who wrote the agenda for each year. He was from Bethesda, and suggested there might be some other people who might bring a little more flash and dash to it that might be kind of interesting. And Betty Jean Lifton's name was mentioned, among others. They never had another section on it.
I would think, and that was my second question, do you suppose that if some proposals were made from those of us within the movement, that they might be responsive, and in particular focusing on the fact that we know a great deal more than we even did 7 years ago about non-attachment issues, and in particularly as it lends itself to psychopathic behaviors, whether it's violent or non-violent.
Sure. Yeah, it could be interesting, and it might be very well worthwhile. I don't know who all is on the program committee, but I can sure get out a book and find out.
One of the things that I hear all too often when we have a hotline, a national hotline, we get so many calls from adoptive parents who are in tears. What did we do wrong? I don't feel guilty. I do feel guilty. This child, and they put them in psychiatric hospitals at the recommendation of a physician, a pediatrician. And the psychiatrist turns around to them and says, adoption has nothing to do with this. Now, if we don't know already that, our professionals need education in this area that they're not getting, or that they haven't gotten in the past, it certainly is becoming more and more obvious.
There's let me say one thing first. There is one nasty trend in this country that I have a hard time with, and that is that there's a whole lot more adolescents going into psychiatric hospitals for a whole lot less valid reasons than in years past. And some kids are going into hospitals simply because they can't get along with their parents, which isn't psychopathology on the kids' part. I mean, some parents are damned hard to get along with. And the problem is that they're staying in hospital a very long time, literally months. And they're chewing up dollars at a horrendous rate and raising the cost of medical care to our nation and raising my premium for health insurance and yours. And it's just one more of the escalations of medical cost in this country that I think is wrong. And I think part of it is the fact that when families get in conflict and the traditional outpatient therapy doesn't work, people will use the hospital as a fallback position because they don't know what else to do. And the youngster will go in for a month, 2 months, 3 months, and when you get all finished, the same kid comes out that walked in a little over half the time. Now, I think that there are some youngsters who are extremely well served by being hospitalized, and major mental illness is identified, and major conflicts are resolved, and it can be a new beginning. But nationally, it's my opinion that the psychiatric hospitals for adolescents are being overused, and the expenses in some areas are excessive.
Expenses
Now, where I am in Wisconsin, we're talking anywhere from $300 to $700 a day. So we can run as high as $5,000 a week. I don't know of more expensive than that in Wisconsin, but I know in other parts of the country it is higher than that, as you said.
Could we get back to political issues?
Sure.
I wanted to talk about the non-attached older adoptee whose parents send the child to the therapist to be fixed and are reluctant to do family therapy. You know, so how to incorporate family system work or parent issues with the adopted issues? Because it's easier for a child, adoptive parents, not always, but some have an easier time sending their children, they're working on their own issues.
Yeah, I agree. I don't see how you can treat an adolescent in a vacuum without involving their family, because they haven't separated and individuated from the family yet. They're still part of the family system. And to try and treat the child without involving the parents, I think is rather foolish. And I don't know how anybody does it. If somebody can tell me how they do it, I'd be interested to hear, but I don't think it's possible. Once the child has separated from the family, once they have become an individual, then you can do individual work with them, and I think very successfully. By the same token, I don't think that all therapy has to be family sessions where everybody has to be there together. I think all therapists sometimes split the family and see each person individually and then bring the family back together and see them as a group. And that depends upon style and philosophy of the therapist. But basically, there's still family therapy, because if a youngster's part of the family and hasn't separated, got to deal with the whole group. At least I do. And I think most other people in the room would feel the same way. Yes, ma'am.
For those people who are interested in non-attachment issues and treatment thereof, if you haven't heard of Alzheimer's Children Without a Conscience, there are extended sections in the book that address how it hasn't been done before, the mistakes that have been made, and direction for addressing the issues and the methodology that, if the child is young enough where it can work.
Right. Yeah, they're
High risk.
high-risk children, people without a conscience. There's a real good question about, that particular personality type. Is it born or is it taught? And there's some people that think that there's a genetic predisposition that is then augmented or squelched depending upon how life goes. It's a good debate. Nobody's got an answer. The pendulum is still swinging. I don't know the answer. And I guess that's probably the one thing that I'd encourage you to take from this session today is that we don't know. The answers are not known. There's more questions than there are answers. But I think we need to continue to work to try and tease things apart. And as time goes by, I think we probably will know. Yes, ma'am.
Can I just give a classic example here? When you mentioned early in the session about why do some adoptees are they so normal and not affected, and others not, okay? I had a most interesting conversation with a clinical psychologist one day, and it just came from out of the blue, and she's telling me how healthy and normal she is, and she didn't want to search, and she was doing just fine, and what's all the fuss and everything. And then she said, when I was 15 years old, she said, I just absolutely had to know. This lady was then in her 40s, okay? She said, I just had to know where I came from, and she said, I tried to get information, and she said, thank heaven somebody stepped me straight on that and told me, why are you chasing this ghost around and trying to get your head together? And so she said, thankfully they put me on straight, so I got rid of that idea, And she babbled on, she spoke on and on, and after a while she said that she had to have her passport, and her amended birth certificate wasn't going to do it, and so she got her adoption papers from her adopted mother and looked at them, and it was like Eve eating the apple. She had committed a big sin. She looked at that paper and saw there was the birth mother's name on it. Now, this woman was crushed. She told me she just went into this
guilt trip that lasted. She had seen something that was so sinful for her eyes to see that there was a birth mother on there. She was unable to function for a while and had to have her husband go and get her passport because she could not function after seeing that name. Okay? Now, I want you to remember that 15, she had wanted information on her birth parents. Okay? Remember that number 15 because she went on to say, and all this time she's telling me how normal she is. And she's saying that she felt so guilty because she felt she had betrayed her adopted mother for looking at this name. She should never have looked at it. And then she's telling me that her adopted mother still calls her every once in a while. I mean, she's in her 40s now. Her mother is like in her 70s. Her mother still calls her and weeps on the phone about, the day that we brought you home from the agency, and this one. See, okay, so all these red flags are going up. And I said, what do you do when you get an adopted person that comes into you for clinical treatment? She said, I won't treat an adopted person. She said, I almost flunked college because I was reading books on adoption. This is a clinical psychologist, okay? Now, she's talking to the other person at the table who brought me into this whole conversation, and they belong in AA together. And she says, well, I'm speaking at an intergroup meeting tonight. She says, I've been an alcoholic since I was 15. She said, I had my first ET when I was 18. Never made the connection. Never made the connection. But she told me in the beginning of the conversation that she was normal, healthy, the good adoptee, didn't want to search. So, if some of our psychologists, and come on, let's be very honest, many psychologists have worked their way into this because they've tried to work their way through a particular problem, and that's their weak spot.
Sure.
So, and if you bring your child to a psychologist who has a hang-up like this lady had, what chance have you got?
You're dead right. Your case vignette is absolutely accurate. I had a professor when I went through residency training who said we're all neurotic. The only question is how much and in what way. And he didn't mean just the people in residency, he meant the whole damn world. And I think he's right. I think there's another facet that's absolutely true, is that many people get into helping professions to solve conflicts that they have in their own lives. I know I went into psychiatry for that reason. I was raised by a paranoid schizophrenic adoptive mother, and so it's perfectly obvious why I would be interested in psychiatry rather than surgery or general practice. And I think many of us are exactly the same way. We go into fields for very good reasons, that if we ever pause and look at ourselves and are honest, it's logical. Of course, your friend, her denial balloon was punctured, and she had a very hard time dealing with that. She had a good defense going for a while. Well, we're about running out of time, and I'm getting hungry. Has anybody got any closing comments they'd like to make? Okay, we'll see you all around the next few days. Thank you for coming.